Thank you so much for joining our guest lecture on Research Day 2026 that is streamed live from Brazil. My name is Ina van den Broek, and I'm a professor of ethnobotany at the Caribbean Center of Research in Bioscience, Faculty of Science and Technology, here at the UII Mona. And I have the pleasure and the privilege today to introduce our special guest speaker. Dr. Rodrigo Carmo is a biologist and associate professor of ecology at the Federal Rural University of Pernambuco in Brazil, where he integrates ecosystem science, political ethnobiology, and biocultural conservation to understand how land use change, climate variability, and development models reshape society-nature relationships in the Global South. Professor Carmo leads research within the Ecological Synthesis and Biodiversity Conservation Lab that has a very nice acronym called ECOFUN. He supervises graduate students in the Ethnobiology and Nature Conservation program, and he serves as Director of Internationalization, fostering South-South scientific cooperation. He's also a member of the Reshaping network, investigating biopsychosocial responses to the climate emergency. Rodrigo's work spans biodiversity conservation, climate health linkages, misinformation and governance, and ethical accountability in ethnobiology. Professor Carmo is committed to science that is rigorous, ethical, and publicly engaged, produced with communities and for society. His lecture title is Roots and Roots, Ethnobiology, Climate Action, and South-South Cooperation across the Caribbean and Latin America. If you have some questions during his lecture, please put them in the chat, and I hope that at the end of his presentation, I will be able to select some and then we can discuss some more. With that being said, I yield the floor to Professor Carmo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ina. Hello, everyone. I hope everything's doing well from here and from there in Jamaica. It's truly a pleasure to be here at the University of the West Indies, even virtually, of course. And I'm very glad to do that. So I also would like to thank very much from Dr. Ina van den Broek and Dr. Curtis Busby-Orley for inviting me to be a part of this very prestigious and important moment at the University of West India, but more than that, for the Caribbean and Latin America in general. I've never been at the Jamaica, sad, I know, but I feel in many ways that this is similarity from my state here in my region, Northeast in Brazil, because we share with you something like climate challenges, but also history, culture, and resilience. So I'm Rodrigo Carmo. It's not a mansplaining. I'm a Black man, husband of a charm doctor, father of a kid that have 4 years old, and a very enthusiastic about people and nature, which made me work with ethnobiology, of course. And today, I want to talk to you about something very simple: how people and nature are inseparable, and why this matters for our future. So basically, ethnobiology leads us to better understand our roots, which ground us, and the routes that we take on to connect us, just like science must to do. So today, I will take you through 3 main ideas. First of all, what is ethnobiology and why it's matters now. The second one, what I call political ethnobiology and why knowledge is never neutral. And finally, how science, collaborations, and South-South cooperation can help us to build a more just and resilient future. At its core, ethnobiology is about a simple idea: the relationship between people and nature. But this relationship is not simple at all. It is a multiple dimension because there is an intricate relationship between different human societies and different ways that this human society interact with the nature. Because of that, we can separate and talk more about the four dimensions: the utilitarian dimension, the ecological dimensions, cognitive one, and the evolutionary dimension. The utilitarian dimensions is more about how we use nature as human. The ecological one means how ecosystems functioning, and the cognitive dimension, how we perceive and classify the world that we live in. And the evolutionary dimensions is how this relationship change over time. But this is not a stand dimension. All of these dimensions is interact each other and make us better understand the perception and the relationship that we do between human and the society fabric, and between the human society and nature in general. But a paper that must be read for all of the people, not only the people that work with ethnobiology, but of course, the people that work with ethnobiologists is must read, but all the scientists, is this one. And not for coincidence, have some good friends here. Dr. Guillermo Don from Guyana, Dr. Ina is here, and make us to better understand the 60th phase of ethnobiology, that we are decolonizing institution, project, and scholarships. At this point, we start to know that ethnobiology is not just about knowledge, it's more about relationships and how can we better understand this relationship between human societies, each other, between human people, and between these differences of the human society with the nature. Here, the authors argue that the ethnobiology should move toward a 60th phase in which scholars and practitioners must actively challenge colonialism, racism, and oppressive structure. That's all. I think that we can think that we are in the time that use the knowledge of the traditional community or indigenous populations, for example, is not more acceptable. We have to co-construct with these people to improve our way to do science. But let me talk about the history of the ethnobiology. First of all, let me change this here from this side here. The first phase is the utilitarian phase, is something like the utilitarian dimensions of the ethnobiology. So here we, as a scientist, are interested to documentations, plants and animal that could be benefit all or intentions to do science, the researchers, society, for example. And at this point, the traditional community and the indigenous population, for example, are not co-constructor with the knowledge. We are constructing our scientific knowledge based on the traditional knowledge, for example. The second phase is the cognitive one. Here, linguistics and psychology are incorporated to the student. For example, how the culture can be accessed to better understand the patterns of this interaction. Remember, ethnobiology is more about the relationship. So here, culture have a huge point to better understand this relationship. And then the third phase is the ethnoecology. Basically, feed from the ecology stricto sensus to better understand this relationship. Here, traditional ecological knowledge is a way to go to better understand this relationship between human societies and nature. But after all the struggling in the fight to rights and to justice, indigenous populations, for example, have a spotlight and the territorialization, for example. And because of that, the fourth phase of the ethnobiology is from this one, the indigenous ethnobiology. Here, increasing awareness of the importance of rights of the indigenous people to control how their knowledge is extracted, but more than that, how this knowledge can be used to provide from these people its rights and the territorializations in general. And the last one before the sixth phase that this paper is talking about is the interdisciplinary area of the ethnobiology, because we can understand that ethnobiology per se are intersectional between some different areas, for example, anthropology, sociology, social sciences, political science, ecology, biology, botany, for example. And at this point, we are interested to solve some problems and to better understand how these issues and problems can be solved based on ethnobiology view. But now we are living in the time that the traditional people and indigenous populations have to co-construct with us as a scientist, because that people do not need the validation of the science in general, don't understand wrong, to live. Of course, what we are doing at the scientists in the academia is very important, because we are discovering processes, we are discovering mechanisms inside the process. But the way to live and the way that the people live each other and interact with the nature is particularly understandable by that people, and have to be co-construct with our way to do that. And that made me evoke this picture, and this picture say for us something very strong and powerful. This is Tuiri Kayapo, indigenous woman that has the leadership of the Kayapo ethnic here in Brazil, and is stayed in front of the director of Eletronorte Belo Monte hydroelectric complex. At that moment, in 1989, the government are improving the way to construct more complexes of hydroelectric dams. So in that moment, the government are trying to better develop the human population in general, but not taking into consideration all the aspects of different populations inside of the territory. For example, the Kayapo ethnic. And the Tuiri Kayapo says that the electricity will not fit that people, and the government should provide the river to run free, because the future of that people don't depend of the electricity, but depend the interaction. And if you construct the Belo Monte hydroelectric complex, you are stopping the flow of the river, and this will stop the culture, stop the interactions, stop the relationship between this society and the nature in general. Well, this is ethnobiology, not as a discipline, but as a resistance, as a territory, as a survival of the people, for example. And Tuiri Kayapo can provide us a very good example how to think political in ethnobiology in general. At this point, this brings us the political ethnobiology. The political ethnobiology basically studies not only knowledge, but how knowledge is shaped by conflicts, power, and identity. And here we can ask, how do communities redefine their knowledge, and in context of environmental pressure, for example? How can we better understand this relationship, taking into consideration the perspective of the traditional communities, for example? And more than that, and more importantly, who gets to decide what counts as knowledge at this point? Because we are scientists, can have the power to decide something, or put a tree here or put a policy that, but we do not consider the traditional communities in general to have this power and to decide what counts as a knowledge, for example. And this makes us step back to better understand some specific concepts to construct the idea of the political ethnobiology. For example, environmental justice, political ecology, the environmentalism of the poor, and the decolonial ecology. I will talk more about each one of these concepts to bring us the concepts of the political ethnobiology, and after that, I will talk what I'm doing with all of this background and conceptual background here. Well, one of the first pillars of the perspective at the ethnobiological, political ethnobiology, for example, is the environmental justice. The idea is very simple, and that means that all people should have equal rights, right? To environmental protections, to health, and to participatory decision making, for example. But the reality is a huge difference, very different from that. Because the environmental risks, for example, are not randomly distributed. They are shaped by inequality, for example, by race, by class, by geography. And this is what we call environmental racism. So environmental racism dictates that the disproportionate exposure of the marginalized communities to ecological hazards is never a coincidence. It is institutionalized outcomes of policy decision that devalue specific lives and landscapes. Bullard told us that the equal participation should be a way, an alternative way to struggling with this environmental racism, because if you have distributive and procedural justice, we have representations and we have recognition of these people, and we can co-construct with these traditional people. Another important foundations is political ecology, and the Henrique Leff told us that the political ecology tell us that environmental conflicts are not just ecological problems, but they are struggling over power, meaning, and control over nature, for example. And here we have a very good example of how political ecology can do at the practice. Here in Brazil, rubber trappers, for example, in Acre, led by Chico Mendes, created the empate. Empate is a Brazilian word, a Portuguese word that means something like standoff. And this is to help deforestation, for example. And Chico Mendes tells us that if you do ecology without political perspective, you are gardening. So we have to do we have to have a political view to do ecology in general, for example. So the question becomes, who defines what is nature and who benefits from it? Leff critique the dominant rationality, for example, the logic that we are using nature as a mercantile way, and the nature have infinite resources to use by the human society in general. Water, food, medical aspects, for example, but we know that this is not true. And for Leff, environmental rationality is an alternative to disrupt this logic of mercantilism of the nature, for example. And because of that, we have to valorate the local knowledge, and more important than that, the biocultural integration. Because if you have the opportunity to construct ecological restoration project, for example, we have to use the biocultural aspects to run this ecological, or now so-called biocultural restoration project, for example. For left, nature is a field of power, and that is the question. Who defines the meaning of nature and who controls its use, for example? But in many parts of the global south, for example, here in Brazil, probably there in Jamaica and the Latin America in general, environmentalism is not a luxury. It is survival for all. Communities defend forests, rivers, and land, not because of the non-material or abstract ideals, but because their lives, the lives, depends of them. So for traditional communities and from indigenous populations, the relationship with the nature is completely different from the relationship that I, as a urban people, as a urban person, for example, have with that. It's more like a family relationship than the resource relationship. So that we call the environmentalism of the poor, the concept that earlier told us. So differently from the environmentalism of the global north, the environmental okay, now it's okay. The environmentalism stems from the need for survival and the defense of territories, natural resources, and traditional knowledge against the extractivism project. That not means that people cannot interact with the nature by do not use the resources, but it is a different perspective. For earlier, the environmentalism of the poor is a critique of the unequal distributions of the arms with this degradation process, for example, into the natural ecosystems. And then the environmentalism of the survivor, the idea inside of the environmentalism of the poor, is basically essential to livelihoods of this community. It's very important because it's linked with the previous one, when I'm talking about the political ecology, for example. And then this is necessary to promote some environmental justice as a class struggle, for example. For earlier, the environmentalism is more a class struggle and the way to promote the environmental justice to solve some conflicts. For example, I'm here now at the meeting at the conservation unit here in the Caatinga that have some problems, because here we are conducted the management plan, but this conservation unit is overlapped with the traditional territorial from the indigenous people, Capinawa, and this is a very complex meeting to solve that problem. For example, how the ecological policy, political ecology, or how ethnobiology can help these people to solve that problem, to not lost territory, and to promote more assertive and more people-based conservative policy here, for example. So all of these things are discussed with the representative people from the indigenous populations, from the government, from the science, for example, to see how to solve this problem with this perspective. So with the political ethnobiology perspective. And then we are finally must talk about the decolonial ecology that are linked with that paper that I show you in the start of my lecture here. So this Martinican, Malcolm Ferdinand, tell us that climate crisis, for example, is not neutral. And he critiques the Anthropocene as that idea of Anthropocene that often suggests that all the people, all the humans are equally responsible to the climate crisis, for example. And here we have to be sensitive, because not all of us are in the same boat. For example, we as a scientist, the Caatinga population, indigenous population, for example, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, is not at the same boat. While I am taking 5 minutes of shower, that people are sending missiles and, well, doing this as a playground. So that the critique of the Malcolm Ferdinand, for example, the decolonial ecology perspective, because the narrative of human error as the case of this crisis is driven by colonial, capitalist, and patriarchal powers. So the climate crisis has color and address. And if you could answer as a quick answer, North and white men are the problem from the climate crisis in general, because all of the history of the humanity constructions are tell us that people is the real problem and drive from the Anthropocene problem of this era, for example. So the crisis is driven by specific themes: colonial, capitalism, and extractive system. Ferdinand talk for us that this is, as I said, have an intersectionality of race, class, and environment. For white and northern bodies are protected at the expense of the sacrifice of the global south bodies in general, and this diverse color and perspectives that we have here in the global south, for example, and lands, toxic waste, meaning, and deforestation, for example. While we are protecting this land from for the world in general, so we have to put some conservative politics to conduct conservative unities here in Brazil, for example, to protect the Amazonia, to protect the Caatinga. I'm not against of this idea. I'm of the idea that we are doing this instead of the people are sending missiles, for example. So this is not an equal equation. So Anthropocene is a fallacia with the all the people have the equal distributions of the problem instead of that. So what is the Malcolm Ferdinand told us as alternatives is the commons of the land. It proposed the constructions of this idea inspired by the ancestral knowledge, the indigenous ones, the African. I told the Quilombola is the maroon population, for example, that I come from the maroon population ancestors, for example. My lineage of my father are the Quilombola here and the maroon population here. So as I said, the nature from our people is not a resources, but rather kindship relationship, like family relationship. So the land is not a property, is the family. So this is important way to think that decolonize ecology and decolonize the perspective to do the science is the first step to run a better ethnobiology researchers ethnobiology project, for example. And all of these reparations for historical harms, for example, can be done by biocultural restoration. So when I, as ecologist, for example, design a project to reconstruct some land that are degraded, I cannot use only my perspective as a scientist, even if I come from the maroon people from here. I have to take in consideration all the people that use and that interact with that land. If that traditional communities or indigenous populations, that people must be listened to run and to design this project. So biocultural restorations, for example, take into considerations not only the scientific aspects of the restoration process, but of course, the cultural perspective of the differences and the different communities that live into or nearby the territory that are restoring. So with that, the autonomy of the Southers people over the territories can be breached. That the opinion and the idea of the Malcolm Ferdinand that I agree as a scientist, for example. So with these concepts in mind, what about now? What do we have to do from now? Maybe the first step could be stop reproducing the same patterns that created the problem, for example, not from here in Brazil or from there in Jamaica, but together as a bridge, because we have a potency to do that. A very good friend of mine that opened the window of the ethnobiology, Dr. Ulisses Paulino Albuquerque, that make me love this field of work that I work now, political ethnobiology, says that the science, specifically ethnobiology, can play a critical role not just in producing knowledge, but in negotiation, conflict resolution, and policy making, for example. Science, for us, should be or can be a bridge between our perspective and between the human society perspectives, taking into considerations that the human society have specificities and the human society can be differences, for example. So I would like to show you what I'm doing at this perspective and show what this looks like in practice. Well, my research here operates across four main areas. I'm younger scientist at the ethnobiology research, but I'm very enthusiastic to better understand how capitalism and how human development, hegemon human development, can disrupt or can affect the human society and relationship between each other and human society in nature from general. So my research operates across four main areas, like you see here at the window: climate change and health, protected areas and well-being, disinformation, that means a little bit different of misinformations, and governance, and biocultural restoration. So I know, different topics, but the same question. How do social and ecological systems interact? So in the Resiclima network that was led by Dr. Ulisses Paulino Albuquerque and now is led by Dr. Washington Soares, we studied something very different that I was usually doing at the ecology background that I have. So Resiclima is a multidisciplinary network that are interested to know how different perspectives, psychology, nutrition, ecology, can make us better understand the problems involved with the climate change and the aspects that involve adaptation and resilience problems or process. I'm sorry. So at this point, I would like to share two different papers that study how climate change affects mental health, for example, but not directly, because we know that when climate change occurs, when I change of the temperature or precipitation, we can feel different, and this directly affect the mental health. But we are not interested in that. We are interested how climate change affect food systems. Food systems affect nutrition, and nutrition affect mental health, for example. At this first paper, we analyze the indirect influence of a global climate change on mental health that we are called climate anxiety. So that was mediated by nutrition and have some linkage with this tool paper, the second paper here, that we are analyzing the impacts of climate change on nutrition and its effects on neuroeducational outcomes. For example, this graphical abstract tells us how this cascade up from the climate change until neuroeducational problems or disorders or mental health, for example. So climate change affects the food chain and the food production and the food equality. So now this is not separated by the capitalism process, because who has access from the food of quality, for example, independent of the region that we're talking about, specifically here in Brazil or in South, in the global South. But in general, people that have more income have more access to buy some food that are high quality, for example. When a climate change affected the food chain, this food equality seems to be to decrease his quality and to decrease the production also. So in a way, if you lose some quality of the food, we have some filters that will affect some different populations because that people don't have access. So the vulnerable people, the more vulnerable people are that people that don't have access to buy this food. Even if you produce the food, that's no make sense at all. So here in Brazil, for example, we are specifically a country that produce commodities, soybean, corn, for example, and the people that produce that don't have access from the production, for example, and climate change can affect this food chain and then decrease the food equality and food availability from these people. And that's the point. The industry use the ultra processed food as an alternative. Very bad solution, because the people that don't have access from the food quality, for example, the fruit or the vegetables or good meat, for example, will buy from the very low price that food that is very ultra processed, and this affect the amino acids and the protein, for example, that are very important to provide more neuroeducational or mental health in our population. Because of that, the people that are economically vulnerable are affected also by this unavailability of this food, for example. So like Malcolm Ferdinand said, this is relationship, is intricate relationship between class, race, and here income, of course. So Black people from here in Brazil, for example, women, and the women that are Black and are poor will suffer more than white heterosexual men, for example. But there is another layer in this perspective, the information, for example, or disinformation. That is a little bit similar to misinformation, but is a specific one, because misinformation means the process that we are not access with the real information, but disinformation, the misinformation that have the people that want to do the misinformations. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but today climate change is not only a scientific issue. This is a race climate results. The guy that are here in the left corner here is my previous master's student, Caatinga, that worked brilliantly with this thesis, and he were interested to know how political stance, disinformation, and information can affect climate concern of all the Brazilian population. So to do that in a master's time, so in 2 years, is important to bring some bridges, because that the routes that we are wait on. So Cloud work with the Institute of Technology and Society from Rio de Janeiro here in Brazil, that are a partnership with the Yale University and the Institute of the Brazilian Institute of the Geography and Stats, that conduct research into the Brazilian population between the Bolsonaro's government. So we take the advantage of the negationism government to better understand how the negationism government can induce the climate concern of the Brazilian people, for example. And we find, it's not a surprise, that the people that are in the right wing are less climate concerned when compared with the left wing, and there is no difference between right and center people from here in Brazil, which makes sense because the social agenda and the environmental agenda of the left wing is more accentuated than the right wing. So Bolsonaro's government, for example, changed everything that we are doing with the conservation policies, for example, and the climate policies here. So we are publishing this as soon as possible, probably in this first semesters, and we are very excited to dive in with this data set also. So another example comes from the protected areas and well-beings. So there is a common assumption for us: protected forests restrict people, like a Yellowstone model of conservation units that we have. I don't know how is working in Jamaica, but here in Brazil, almost all the conservation policies is based on the North way, with some difference from here in Brazil. So the Yellowstone model from here doesn't work. This is like a paper park that are a park or the conservative unit in the paper, but doesn't work to fight against the deforestation, for example, or to provide some human well-being. So here, we are trying to better understand this relationship in protected area and well-being using the Caatinga region as a model. Just to let you know the context of the Caatinga is very specific ecosystems from here in Brazil. That is a patch of vegetation and is located at the northeast in the country. So this infographic here is made by Map Biomas, is a NGO that work with this satellites analysis and provide us the more valuable and the good way to better understand the processes of the Caatinga and of all the ecosystems and biome that we have here in Brazil. So we have data set from the 1985 until 2 years ago, and we can see that the Caatinga region is shifting the natural vegetation to farming. In all the Brazil was occur, but the Caatinga is increasing and have a specificity here in Caatinga because this ecosystem is very biodiversity, but at the same time hosts very huge dense population inside of the territory. I'm now at the Caatinga, at the National Park of Catimbau, work on with the indigenous people and the traditional communities to co-construct the conservative policies, for example. And what we see is that some regions from the Caatinga is changed by the human activities. So the Anthropocene exists, but this change, this shift is not made by the traditional people, is made by the commodities in general. Because if you see here, we are shifting this natural area to the yellow, the light yellow here. That means is the farming process, for example. So that's what we are interested to understand. So we asked what happens to the local well-being when we apply the protected area into the Caatinga, for example. Here we have a complex human society installation. For example, we have the Capinawa population, that is the indigenous people, but we have the Caatingueiros. The Caatingueiros is the people that live in the Caatinga and have a different way to interact with the nature. So that people depends of the natural resources from the cultural aspect, from the utilitarian aspect also, but are different from the indigenous people also. So the Caatinga is a patch of the biodiversity, a patch of the vegetation area, but a patch of the human societies also. So we asked what happens to the local well-being when we are using the protected areas, for example. So that the guy, Arthur Barros, the PhD candidate that I'm advising, and we are using 4 different conservative unities: the environmental protected area, the restricted protected area, the indigenous territory, there's a little bit differences here, and the sustainable use protected area. So the hypothesis is when more restrictive roast is the well-being aspects of these people. Well, when we block the interactions between traditional communities to the land, to the territory, we are blocked the cultural development, we are blocked the relationship. So we our hypothesis is that the sustainable use protected area, for example, is more is directly correlated with the human well-being aspects. So in first hand, this is not published yet, but this is the first draft of the results from the Arthur dissertation. We can see that only environmental protected area increase deforestation. So here is deforestation, is not a natural cover. So, but we can see that restricted protected area and indigenous territories have significant effects on decreased deforestation processes. So what about the well-beings? We analyze 4 different aspects of socioeconomic a way to better understand the well-being. For example, income per capita. Here is the Brazilian currency, reais, and we can see that indigenous territories decrease income per capita in the protected areas compared with the others, because while the indigenous territories decrease deforestation, there is not public policies that provide some specific human development from that people. So that the critics, we romanticize the way that the indigenous populations lives, for example. So indigenous populations is not the people that live inside the nature only. The development, the culture, and the need to get access for the things. So we are living in the capitalism, so that people should to have access also. So here we are seeing that the indigenous territories decrease income per capita, while the strict protected area and sustainable use of protected area are increasing the income per capita. Is a little bit obvious, because when we are able to use the resource and to have access from the other things to get income, this way we occur. But restoration is the way to restore landscapes, of course, but trees alone do not do that. So we need more than plant trees to restore some degraded landscapes, for example. So landscapes are more than ecological or more than trees. They are people, they are knowledge, they are cultural or culture, for example. So because of that, we have to use biocultural frameworks, not the ecological frameworks to restore degraded areas, for example. We have to co-construct with that people using our knowledge as a scientist, as an ecologist, to see how that people can interact with the land and how can co-construct some frameworks to do that. That picture is very beautiful because remember me when I stay in Kenya with the Masai Mara people and work with the savannah and to see how the agribusiness, for example, are degraded the area and how can we co-construct with that people to do the biocultural restoration frameworks, for example. So that's a very hands-on picture, and with the Masai Mara in the background and the scientists with different nationalities from Mexico, Spain, Brazil, Kenya, Italy, work together to better understand the problem and to co-construct with that people how to restore that landscape. So we are working with the partners in Africa, include this project in Kenya, and that are different continents, but the same challenge, the same need for integrate solutions. So this make us to better understand how ethnobiology works. So we have to live in with the people for a while and to better understand the perspective of that people and to respect this perspective and work together. So here in the first picture is the open market in the Nairobi, nearby to Nairobi in the Masai Mara region. And the below picture is the workshop that we are conducting to better understand the perspective of different communities, because they are not only the Maasai, they don't have only Masai Mara population, but have conservancy population and the political aspects also. So we construct this framework that get together restoring nature, repurposing nature and repairing nature with different perspectives, but work together with the intersectional. So biocultural frameworks should have in mind the values of the nature and of the people that live within the nature, the biodiversity in general, including the cultural one and the cultural keystone species. As the old debate, what is the cultural keystone species, for example. Here in the Caatinga, we have Arecacia tree that produce some coconuts. We call licuri, and this is a example for the cultural keystone species because it's very important to provide some biodiversity from the ecology, but also provide the relationship between the traditional population with the nature, for example. And of course, the multifunctionality that are including basically all the function that the species have together with the benefits from the people. So biodiversity and ecosystems functioning is shifting from the nature contributions for the people. So basically multifunctionality feed with this area. And then this bring me to the very end of my lecture and bring us back to where we started. For example, roots and roads, what it means. Roots remind us where we belong. So, and this background here is the Mimosa tenuliflora, if I'm not wrong. The Jurema preta is another important tree from the indigenous populations here. Is a whole tree from the Caatinga. And the roots remind us where we belong. And the routes remind us we can become together like a scientist, and basically science do that. We are connecting people, for example, me and Dr. Ina, Brazil, Jamaica, Kenya, England, for example, to co-construct with different perspectives. Leonardo Boff is a Brazilian philosopher that told us that a point of view is just a view of the point. So we can take some results from my perspective, but I have to consider different perspectives to better understand the whole processes. So science must be grounded in territory, but connected across the borders, for example. And this bring me how to co-construct with different perspectives, with different way to think in different ways with this editorial in the ethnobotany and economic botany. I would like that the people could read it because it's a beautiful paper. So at the end, I would like to evoke the artist from Brazil. Is a rapper that told me and told us that they tried to bury us as a person, but they didn't know we are seeds and we are resprouting and growing up in this land. So thank you very much from the audience. Thank you again, Dr. Ina, for inviting me. And I hope that we are enjoying as I enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Rodrigo. I'm glad that this lecture is being recorded so we can look at it again and again. You certainly have left us with so much food for thought, and I'm really mind blown by how you bring different fields together. Economy, information technology, ecology and conservation, and philosophy, and even music, right? And some of the sentences that you said struck me also very much. Nature as a field of power. And I wanted to ask you, um, can you comment a bit on nature as a field of power versus knowledge, academic knowledge, and traditional knowledge as a field of power?
Yeah, sure. Nature is a field of power because who defines nature is, that's the first steps. So if we can define the thing is, we have the power to do what we want with that thing. So if you understand that nature is basically a thing that we can use, we have the power to conduct everything that we want to do that. And we do not take into consideration the other perspective, for example. So we have to provide voices to different perspectives to better understand how that people, how different societies understand the nature. Because of that, nature is the field of power. When we have the power to define the nature and we have the power to better understand the relationship between the human communities and human society with that, we can better understand those relationships. I don't know if I answered you.
You did, you did. And these are conversations to be had, to be
Yeah.
continued. And I look forward very much of doing that with you. I also want to say that we have an MOU developed, a Memorandum of Understanding for collaboration with your university. And I warmly invite our faculty who has followed your talk and who's interested in reaching out and developing projects together with us. Welcome. Because it's, as you say, science across border and I think across disciplines as well. So with that being said, I want to thank you so, so much for coming today and giving this special lecture on Research Day 2026. It was a treat, and I look forward to continue working with you. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you very much for your kind message and for your kind conversation that we have before this meeting. And of course, we have the MOU, and we are completely open to contribute with development with this agreement and to work together. For me, as a younger scientist that work in the field of ethnobiology, is very important to have a reference from you, for example, that are my reference in ethnobotany from Dr. Ulisses here in Brazil, and to bring together and to work with this bridge to better understand the aspects of the political ethnobiology. So for sure, we will contribute and work together in the future. Thank you very much.